Yemen's Ansarullah movement has released video footage of a major incursion into Saudi Arabia's border regions. Yemeni media said the operation took place in the kingdom's southern region of Jizan. More than 80 Saudi soldiers and mercenaries were killed or injured, while dozens were captured. The offensive is part of Yemen's retaliatory military campaign against the Saudis. Yemenis have been stepping up attacks on Saudi Arabia in recent months. They say that retaliatory strikes will continue as long as Riyadh continues its airstrikes and blockade. Saudi Arabia, backed by the U.S. and other regional allies, launched a devastating war on Yemen back in March of 2015 with the aim of reinstating a Riyadh-friendly regime there. That objective has not been achieved, but hundreds of thousands of Yemenis have so far lost their lives due to the war. And now joining us for the program is Brett Yonkers, historian and journalist, joining us from Hasselt, Belgium, and Tony Gosling, investigative journalist, joining us from Bristol. Gentlemen, I'd like to welcome you both to the program here. Tony, I guess we'll start with you. Your thoughts on 6 years plus of war on Yemen, and the more that we're seeing the resistance there against the Saudi aggression, it seems to be getting more and more sophisticated.
Well, look, to start, the UN, the humanitarian agency, the OCHA, at the end of last year released figures for the number of dead in Yemen, 250,000 nearly. By now, I'm sure it will be up to 250,000. Now, this is getting absolutely ridiculous because the Saudi government, if we can call it that, is really a dictatorship. There's no elections there. There's really no even attempt to try and see if the people of Saudi Arabia want or approve of their leaders and what their leaders do, their leaders' objectives. And so this is the government that has been perpetrating this war. Let me also say, though, that as a British person, I believe that this is actually a proxy war that Saudi is arranging for the NATO countries, particularly the United States and Britain. It's a history of the European powers, France as well, having a great deal of interest and influence in the Middle East, with the redrawing of the borders back in the First World War, the Sykes-Picot Agreement. These colonial powers basically carving the land up for their own interests, and I believe that's still happening today. This sort of war serves the British in two ways. First of all, it's a great market for their aircraft, for their munitions, and there are many British personnel in Saudi Arabia training the Saudi Air Force in order to make sure that they can keep perpetrating these cowardly attacks from the sky on the Yemenis. So there's a big influence there in that we get, as British, the British Armed Forces get a sort of playground to play with our weapons and to see which works, see what doesn't work, which is an appalling way to look at it. But we never see that in the Western press at all. The other thing that the British are doing there, of course, is making a tremendous amount of money selling these munitions to the Saudi Arabian oil-rich nation. And I think the Saudis, since the West is going over to electric cars, should start watching themselves very closely, because it might be that the West has already decided that the oil is going to stop at some point because of a flare-up in the Middle East, and so they're not going to be dependent on Saudi Arabia anymore. But the actual figure of 250,000 is the official UN figure now of the number of people who are dead in Yemen. It is by far the worst crisis in the world, and it could easily be stopped, literally in a blink of an eye, if the British Prime Minister said stop aiding the Saudi government.
Thank you, Tony. And Brett Yonkers, I'd like to welcome you to the program. Brett, your initial thoughts on this?
Well, my thoughts on the offensive that is going on and now is it is, of course, it's a massive retaliatory strike by the Yemeni resistance against what is now over 6 years of unbridled Saudi aggression that has indeed resulted in tens of thousands of people being brutally and mercilessly killed, the absolute majority of them being civilians who have done absolutely no harm to Saudi Arabia or to anyone for that matter at all. Even with the historic proportions of the strike, the slap against Saudi imperialism that the Yemenis have given, it is not surprising for those who have been following this conflict closely for a while now, because we know that the Yemenis have made a habit out of surprising even the best expectations, and on basically being an inspiration, in my opinion, to the Arab world, to the Islamic world, and basically to all of the global South in general, in terms of resisting, despite all odds, and overcoming seemingly insurmountable obstacles. We're talking now about an operation that is fully taking place within Saudi Arabia. That is important to note. These are 150 square kilometers of Saudi-occupied land, of land that has been officially recognized as being part of Saudi Arabia for decades, and is officially registered, of course, according to international treaties, as Saudi territory, the territory, the state of Jizan. So when the Yemenis have succeeded in not just striking back against the Saudis in Ma'rib, in Aden, in Saada, in Sana'a, and in other places of Yemen, but also are now effectively pushing back the Saudis, and not just across the border, but deep inside the border, 150 square kilometers of Saudi lands that have been completely lost by the Saudis. This is a retaliation strike of absolutely unseen and epic proportions that is absolutely likely to make military analysts, both in Saudi Arabia and in the imperialist backers of Saudi Arabia, reconsider what they were doing. Bear in mind that back in 2015, when this war started, the strategic battle plan of Saudi Arabia and their allies was, we will be in Sana'a in a couple of weeks. Now we're 6 years further. The Saudis are not closer to Sana'a than they were in the beginning. And in fact, the Yemenis are standing 150 kilometers inside Saudi land. So this is a strike back against invasion, against occupation, against hegemony, and against imperialism in general, that is absolutely earth-shattering and will absolutely bear fruit in the short run and in the long run, in terms of ending this conflict and resulting, hopefully, in a Yemeni victory.
Thank you, Brett. And Tony, you mentioned that if Boris Johnson wanted to end this thing, he could tell Riyadh to cool it and it'll be done. But we saw, as soon as he got voted into office, U.S. President Joe Biden said exactly that. He said this war has to end. We're going to stop supporting the Saudis with weapons they're using on the Yemenis. How come nothing has changed on the ground, Tony?
Well, I think it's because actually the British are playing quite a big and important role here in supporting the Saudis. But I think we also ought to look at one of the unquantifiable things in this war. It's very difficult to put your finger on, which is the morale of the fighters. I think you'll find that within the Saudi Arabian, basically the Air Force, which is doing almost all of the fighting here, you've got a handful of people who are just dropping bombs from a great distance with invulnerability. What we've seen in this particular strike is actually territory gained. And one of the major problems for the Saudis is what happens when the Yemeni forces actually start to strike at the Saudi air bases. There, all of a sudden, the war from the Saudi side starts to crumble. And there's very little they can do. And I think we've got to understand that when you're working just simply for the money in an army and nothing else, and there's no real ideology behind what you're doing, and you know that actually what you're doing is breaking international law, not upholding it, then those soldiers and those fighters, I think, on both sides I'm talking about here, will either crumble on the Saudi side, or actually they will charge forward on the Yemeni side, because the morale of the forces on both sides here, they all know, both sides know the difference between right and wrong. The tactics that have been used here is the West have basically put in their puppet president in Yemen, and then the local people obviously decided to overthrow them. You know what? Something very similar has been going on in Ethiopia. This is the Western playbook. They put themselves in a puppet president, and then once the local people realise this guy's working for foreign powers, and that's exactly what then you start to get an uprising. That's exactly what happened in Yemen, exactly what's happened in Ethiopia too. These things only work for a short period of time, and with the backing of the Western press and with vast amounts of Western money. If any of those things fail, then so will the Saudi attacks on Yemen. And you could even suggest that many of these very spirited Yemeni forces may start to overrun important facilities in Saudi Arabia itself.
And Brett, why is that? I'm going to put that same question to you. Why is it? Forget about the leaders, but even when it comes to lawmakers, we've seen them out of London, Paris, Washington. They get really hot on this thing for a while to try to put an end to support, at least military even support for Saudi Arabia. We hear the word war crimes being thrown around, what's happening to the Yemeni the civilians there and their infrastructure. But it seems like it's followed by a lull. Even when it comes to actual military aid, there's actually bills that are presented to put an end to arming the Saudis any further with respect to what's going on. But then even that basically ends up bottled and they're back to business as usual. Why?
Well, I think because in terms of imperialist politicians and politicians in the imperial core of the West in general, mainstream politicians in the West, they are, for a major part, they are extremely good at playing the public opinion, and they know what is popular, they know what lives amongst the people, and they know how to play into matters such as this. But it doesn't always necessarily mean that they intend to act on it. We have to remember that Donald Trump was basically elected for a big part on a platform of non-intervention and of international, let's say, withdrawal and the America First policy. After which he was elected on this platform, he basically never acted upon it because it was not in the interest of the military-industrial complex and the powers that be behind the president in the United States, being things such as the CIA and the Pentagon and what is there. So when you see a similar anti-war rhetoric being spewed this time being spread by the Democrat side by Joe Biden, or even in other Western nations, without continuous public pressure on them to, let's say, to keep their word and to actually act upon it, in many cases there is always a risk that this will remain just talk. That is not to say that there hasn't been a change, I think, in United States policy towards Saudi Arabia. I think there is definitely behind the scenes a growing, let's say, dissatisfaction with in American circles and probably also in British and other Western circles with the brazen actions of Mohammed bin Salman and the elite in Saudi Arabia. This dissatisfaction stems for a major part, not so much about the fact that Saudi Arabia is a brutal regime that massacres innocents, because we've known that for decades. But this dissatisfaction comes from the major part of the fact that they are completely unsuccessful in achieving any lasting results. They have been unsuccessful despite all the billions and billions of support that they have gotten, despite having the most high-tech army in the Arab world. They have failed miserably in trying to subdue the poorest country in the Arab world, which is the Republic of Yemen. And this continuous failure, paired with growing public opinion pressure and these images being shown, of course, to the public opinion of what is actually happening in Yemen, has started to make American politicians uneasy about, let's say, the unconditional support for Saudi Arabia. And that is why an offensive like this is extremely important, because this can kick down another pillar of, let's say, the Saudi hegemony, militarily speaking, in the region, which can then also push the public pressure against Saudi Arabia even more, and eventually
thank you, gentlemen.
Hopefully drawing all U.S. support for the Saudi-led invasion.
Yeah, sorry to jump in there, Brett, but we are out of time. I want to thank you both for joining us. Brett Yonkers, historian and journalist, joining us from Belgium, and Tony Gosling, investigative journalist, joining us out of Bristol. And viewers, that's a wrap for this segment of your Press TV's news review program. Thank you for tuning in, and goodbye for now.